Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 190 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions, your one-stop shop for all things FCPA compliance related. I hope by now you've checked out my new website, the FCPA Compliance Report, where I collect in one location my social media offerings, both blog posts, podcasts, and I'm very excited to be able to offer white papers for download. I have my first one, which is on how do you do compliance in an economic downturn. Today you're in for a real treat because I interview author Vivian Carpenter on her new legal thriller, The Fifth Letter. She tackles a lot of very interesting issues, but the one that I found most appropriate to FCPA compliance is corporate personhood. How do you bring charges? What are the rights of a corporation? How does a corporation work in American legal system? The episode comes in at just under 24 minutes. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for listening. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today you are in for a real treat because I have fellow U of M grad Vivian Carpenter visiting with us about her debut political thriller novel, which I've had the privilege to read. It's called The Fifth Letter. Vivian, thank you very much for taking the time to visit with us.
And thank you for inviting me.
In addition to being a fellow U of M grad, where Vivian has a degree in, in engineering, industrial and operations research. You have an MBA and Doctor of Philosophy in Business Administration. You've worked at various governments, universities, what I would call private practice as a lawyer, and have a very well-rounded career. And now you are a published novelist. Congratulations.
Well, thank you.
For those who have not heard yet of The Fifth Letter, you will, because it is a really rollicking great story, and it's got many different stories going on. So, Vivian, I'd really like to ask you to describe the novel, if you could, and tell us what led you to write this, because you've got a lot going on in this book.
Well, The Fifth Letter is a story about the first African-American female on the U.S. Supreme Court, and she wants to be a great justice, and she struggles to do what's right in the face of a number of people trying to manipulate her, loved ones as well as people who have other objectives for trying to influence the course of the nation. So she has to stand up and figure out how she is going to be effective in the face of threats and overcome fear to become great. And that's a theme that plays over and over again in The Fifth Letter, different people figuring out how they're going to overcome fear to become great in their life. For me, one of the really enjoyable parts, and key parts, was the backstory about Catherine's mother, and which was Hattie's story. And it was the story of an African-American woman who grew up in the South, was subject to a sexual assault. The family protected her and suffered the consequences of, pretty bad racism from that time period. And for me as a Southerner, that really resonated with a lot of the things that I grew up with in the segregated South. How did you develop that part of the story? Because, frankly, I thought that could have been a standalone book. It was so great. Well, my maiden name is Thomas, and my grandfather's name was Clarence Thomas, and I happen to have a lot of oral family history as to different things that happened back at that point in time, and I decided to write a story that was inspired by all of those stories that could never be proven just because of the nature of what the stories were. And so I decided to use that as a basis, but the book quickly took on a life of its own. I ended up hiring William Martin, who wrote The Lost Constitution and the Lincoln Letters, as my editor, and he kept challenging me to come up with the spine, to come up with the legal issue that would run through the entire book. And that issue turned out to be, who is a
person with inalienable rights in America. So it was inspired from my life history. It was inspired from my search for my family history. And there were a number of stories, and I read a lot of books. I had a lot of long conversations with my uncles, my fathers, relatives, who gave me some insight on what it was like to live during that point in time.
Wow. My grandmother's maternal maiden name was Thomas. So yet another connection.
Yes.
I was very surprised, maybe that's too strong a word, when I first read the first 50 pages or so, I could see the legal thriller part of this coming through, and somehow I had the idea that you'd gone to U of M Law School, so I was doubly excited because that's where I went to law school. And then I read your full bio to say, oh, you're not a lawyer at all. Yet you've created not only a legal thriller, but as you said, you integrated discussions, substantive discussions of the law. What does it mean to be a person with inalienable rights in America?
But I do have a strong tie to Michigan's law school. My first husband was a first-year law student at the University of Michigan when he died, and he happened, and I happened to have inherited all of his legal books, and I worked with the Black law students at Michigan to create a scholarship fund, and I have gone back to Michigan every year, almost every year, except for when I've been traveling, to attend a dinner at the law school, and they bring in some of the best legal experts in the country to celebrate his life. So you're correct. There is a very strong connection to Michigan's law school.
And two of my best friends are in that organization, and they were at that dinner this year. Because they told me about it. I saw them this summer. Wow. But more than just a legal question about who has inalienable rights in America, you touched on something that I think is a really important discussion that hasn't really been at as much of the forefront, and it actually touches upon the area of law that I practice in, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and that's what you call corporate personhood and how it has evolved. Could you expound on kind of your thoughts on that a little bit?
Well, back in 1819, the Supreme Court had a case where the first issue of the corporation being a person emerged as a legal fiction. And as we went through time, that legal fiction has gained strength. The issue of who is a person in America with inalienable rights has been an issue since the very beginning. In the beginning, slaves were just 3/5 of a person. Women were not considered persons, and poor white men were not considered persons either. Only property owners were initially considered persons. And so this notion of who is a person in America has continued to grow as we've gone through time. When we had the 14th Amendment passed, which was intended to give the former slaves more rights, we saw more states identifying corporations as persons. And really that says that the corporation has the same rights as individuals, but what has happened over time is that the rights of individuals are now inferior to the rights of corporations. And that's why this is an issue that America needs to pay attention to, because if we have corporate shells that can be purchased by foreigners, we actually have U.S. constitutional rights that can be purchased by foreigners, and that can lead to a weakening of our national security.
And that topic is very relevant, very prevalent. It's called a reverse merger. Chinese companies are doing it day in and day out. They're coming in and buying out shell corporations and installing Chinese as executives. So spot on there. And in fact, this past spring we had a court case out of the Texas Supreme Court where the court denied an individual the right to sue for libel and slander for a corporate internal investigation, holding the corporation had superior rights to the individual in that case. So it's something that's really on the forefront.
Yeah, and that really came to me. I held a CPA license for about 30 years, and the last time I went to continuing professional education, I had an instructor who was an assistant director in the enforcement section of the SEC who came right out and said that corporations have superior rights to individuals. And I think that's something that the people in America have to take a good look at. And I think we need to take a good look at it right now, and we have Supreme Court Justice Catherine Ross, who is the main character in the fifth letter. We end that book with her calling for an amendment to the Constitution, and that amendment is, we the people are human beings. And I think that we are going to have to deal with that socially constructed reality that the Supreme Court created without the president, without the Congress. You know, that is a legal fiction that served a purpose for a long period of time. Now it needs to be examined again, and I think the Supreme Court is not going to take that issue on until the people wake up and show that that is an unacceptable interpretation of our U.S. Constitution.
Vivian, that leads into the next question I wanted to ask you, which is, what did we, the people, mean back in the 1800s, and what do you think it means today?
Well, in 1787, they had a lot of debates, and in order to get our Constitution, there were a lot of compromises made, and it was not a perfect document. However, it was the best that could be done at the time, and both George Washington and Ben Franklin didn't like all aspects of it, but they said we could amend this over time. So we the people, who was a person under the Constitution, as I mentioned before, women were not considered to have rights back at that point in time. The slaves certainly were not full citizens whose rights were protected at that point in time, and all persons were not fully protected at that time. But over time, we all have celebrated the words of the Constitution, the spirit of the Constitution, and we have sought to bring that forward. So today, who is a person? We have a large number of people who are included under that umbrella who are natural-born citizens, but we also have corporations, a super class of citizens that the Supreme Court has said has constitutional rights. And so far they have been granting constitutional rights more so for the corporate interests than for the individuals.
The book really speaks to that issue as well as I mentioned, race relation issues, but also to an individual black woman who is the first Supreme Court justice, and the pressure on her, the scrutiny on her, the number of constituents pulling her different ways, the pressure just would seem to have been quite intense. You've been an African-American woman in America in a largely white world. Is that something you were able to draw on from your personal experience being a professional all these years?
I think there's no question that this character was developed from my personal experience. I happen to have been Deputy State Treasurer of the state of Michigan at the age of 26, and I was able to observe a lot of the lobbying goes on, a lot of, I'll call it, support that special interest provides government officials. And I've also had an unusual career in terms of being president of an investment company that had a minority interest in a casino that was a joint partner with Mandalay Bay. And so I I've had security similar to her security issues, and so I was able to relate to that. And so a lot of this was drawn from my personal experience, from my travels, and from the challenges that I have faced in life. Having a professional career that has allowed me to walk through a lot of incredible doors.
So when I first moved to Michigan to go to graduate school, which is actually at Michigan State, before I went to law school in Michigan, it was at the end of the tenure of Bill Milliken as governor of Michigan. And even while he was governor, he seemed to have a reputation that I think very few politicians had. Could you just give us a sense of what it was like to work for Bill Milliken?
He was wonderful. He was the greatest gentleman you could ever meet. He actually had his personal legal counsel train me so that I would know how to operate in a big bureaucratic structure and do things the right way. He encouraged me to have healthy relationships with the politicians in Detroit, and he was a bridge builder. I can't think of a better public official that anyone could ever have to work for. And he had a very efficient organization. People worked very hard, but they were of high ethical and moral values. And so it was an organization that I feel blessed to have had the opportunity to work for, and a lot of those long-term relationships are still supporting me now.
If I could change the subject, or at least the focus, just a minute, in reading a little bit of background on yourself and how you came to write this book, I'm not sure it started out as a labor of love, but it was certainly a labor. And at one point, I think you had a text of over 750 words. That's far above what the final page count is. Could you tell us about, I guess a couple of things intrigue me. One, how did you have the courage and perseverance to write this? And then what was that process like for you to go through the editing process? You spoke a little bit about it being challenged to develop a real hard storyline. Could you tell us about that process?
Well, in the beginning, I thought my book was going to be about Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. But as the book developed, I realized that he was not the right focus, and the book took on a life of its own when I selected John Galt to be the name of the conservative justice. And initially, I just started on a road of writing a book that would address some of the issues about my personal family history. But as I worked on it and I realized I had to understand how Supreme Court justices talked. I had to understand their jurisprudence. And then I was challenged by William Martin to find a legal issue that ran through the book. It really took on a life of its own, and there were an incredible number of coincidences that emerged as I wrote the book, and it was almost like I was following a trail. And then I struggled to find out who the main character was, and finally I realized that it wasn't the conservative justice, it wasn't Hattie. It was Hattie's daughter, that she was the one that could reach all of the places in the story that I needed to reach, that could bring all of these chapters. So I had an incredible number of chapters and pages, and I had significant research in 1776 and 1787. I had 125 pages. The bill said, you are a much better historical fiction writer than you are current day, but we don't have room for this, and it all had to go. So it was a process of learning the craft of writing, being responsive to the challenges of a very good mentor, and letting the story take on its own life, and not constraining it by my own perceptions of what the elements of a good story should be. And I really researched what are the elements of a good story, how do I keep my audience engaged, and Bill had me rewrite the front end of it, probably the first one-third of the book, probably, 50 times. We kept searching for the right opening chapter.
Well, I think you've hit the right opening chapter, and what I really wanted to say to you was that not only have you produced a book that was, like I said, rollicking fun to read, but you produced a thought-provoking book, and I think that you produced a book that will encourage the debate in many areas, from the corporate personhood to what does it mean to have inalienable rights, to race relations in America, to what's the role of the Supreme Court vis-a-vis the executive and legislature. And you managed to put that in a way that I think is educational. So my kudos to you for coming up with this, and thank you for having it sent to me.
Yeah, and what I really enjoyed about writing fiction is that I could put in place multiple points of view, that this is not propaganda, that I tried to let every character, present their position as strong as they could. And so I hope that it's a book that will open up the way a lot of people think about a lot of issues and make us not so easy to just give into legal fictions that may put us on the wrong road. And so I did write it as a piece that would educate, provoke thought, and hopefully provoke action and get people to understand that we are not powerless. Individually, we all have something that we can do to move us closer to the dream of what America should really be.
That's excellent. Just a great way to end our interview here. But I did want to ask if anyone wanted to follow up with you, could they email you? And if so, how would they do it?
Yes, they can email me at vivian@thefifthletter.com. That's VIVIAN@thefifthletter.com. I have two websites. I have the Vivian Carpenter website, where I do my personal blogging, and then I have the fifthletter.com website, where I've just started to put on blogs that relate to topics that are directly related to the book. And I don't know if you noticed that I did put your blog on there currently, because I was deeply grateful and impressed with the level of thought that you put into your review of the Fifth Letter and relating it to the crisis in Brazil.
Well, and really the corporate personhood issue is something that touches and permeates the entire FCPA debate, and I've used your book as a teaching moment with several of my colleagues. So it's been useful for me, and probably you weren't thinking about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act when you wrote it.
I'm aware of it because I've taught it, but I wasn't thinking about it. I actually had some experiences in my own life that made me think about the possibilities of what could happen if we continue to let foreigners purchase U.S. constitutional rights. So I can't say I had the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in mind, but I knew about it, and I knew what the implications were.
Well, Vivian, like I said before we got started, I could probably visit with you for hours, but fortunately we're at the end of our time. I greatly appreciate you taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Well, thank you.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye.
This is Tom Fox again. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I hope you have had a chance to look at my new website, FCPAcompliancereport.com, where I collect all of my social media offerings, blogging, podcasting. I also have a new white paper that's available for download, so please check that out, and I'd love your feedback on the site. Also, if you could go to iTunes and rate this podcast, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to visiting with you again.